As someone who's been a Goo Goo Dolls fan since at least 1993 and used to have a complete girl crush on John Resnick, this is going to be something special. In the late 1990s, the West Coast liked its feelings big, scenic, and slightly over-amplified. It was the era of coastal highways at sunset, of movies that treated Los Angeles like a spiritual condition, of radio stations that could turn a 3-minute song into a shared public utility. If the decade had a signature romantic move, it was this. Take an ordinary human ache, place it in a wide-open emotional landscape, and let it echo until someone in a Honda on Highway 101 suddenly needed to pull one hand off the steering wheel to wipe their face. Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls didn't invent that move, but it perfected it so thoroughly that for a lot of people, the 1990s simply never stopped happening the moment the first chords hit. Before Iris became the kind of song that can make strangers sing together in a grocery store parking lot, the Goo Goo Dolls were a very different sort of American band story. They came out of Buffalo, New York in the mid-1980s, scrappier than glamorous, built on the classic small club formula of friends, volume, and stubbornness. John Resnick and Robbie Takek were the core personalities, with a background that leaned more punk and college rock than candlelit balladry. By the time the band broke through to a wider audience in the 1990s, they already had years of touring and a catalog that proved they could write hooks without sanding off all their rough edges. They'd had a major hit with Name in 1995, a song that nudged them toward a more melodic, emotionally direct sound, and signaled that Resnick, in particular, had a gift for turning private unease into something radio-friendly. That success mattered because it set the stage for what would happen next. A band with underground credibility learning, in real time, how to fill bigger rooms without losing the thread of who they were. Then Hollywood called, which is how so many cultural moments in America get their official stamp. Iris was written for the soundtrack of the 1998 film City of Angels, the Nicolas Cage and Meg Ryan romance that turned Los Angeles into a kind of dreamy purgatory, where love and mortality stare at each other across a sunlit balcony. Now, I'm going to be real here. City of Angels is not a very good movie. It's kind of boring. Its characters are flat. The motivations are very basic. And when you realize that it's actually an Americanization of a much better 1987 German movie called Wings of Desire, or Der Himmel über Berlin in its native tongue, the result is actually kind of flat. Some people may like it, that's all fine to me, but I thought it was just very dull and misled. Anyway, after seeing an early cut of the movie, Resnick wrote Iris while thinking about the story's central premise. An immortal being willing to give up eternity for the chance to feel a fully human life with someone he loves. It's a concept that sounds almost too dramatic to survive contact with real-world listening. Yet that's exactly what the song does. Instead of playing it like fantasy, it translates that premise into something painfully ordinary. The desire to be known, the fear of being seen too clearly, the willingness to risk everything for a moment of connection. Resnick later explained that he was drawn to the idea of loving someone so much you'd surrender everything else for them. And he built the song around that emotional dare. There's also a wonderfully specific, very West Coast detail hiding in the song's title. No character named Iris appears in City of Angels, and the word doesn't show up in the lyrics, which only made the title feel more mysterious in the era when fans still argued about such things without instantly consulting their phones. Resnick named it after Iris Dement, whose name he reportedly noticed in a concert listing in the LA Weekly. It's the kind of small accident that could only happen in a city stuffed with listings, bills, flyers, and the constant hum of "something's happening tonight." Los Angeles didn't just host the film, it quietly helped christen the song. Musically, Iris is one of those tracks that sounds inevitable, like it always existed, and the Goo Goo Dolls merely discovered it one afternoon. That illusion is part of its genius. Under the hood, it's full of deliberate choices that make it feel both intimate and enormous. Resnick used a non-standard guitar tuning, often described as 4 Ds and a B with no E string, with the low string down to B and the rest tuned to D in different octaves. That creates a droning, chiming bed of sound, like an anxious heartbeat you can strum. The record also features mandolin and guitar colors beyond the typical alternative rock toolkit, and it leans into a slow build structure that keeps raising the emotional ceiling without snapping the melody's spine. The production, credited to Rob Cavallo and the band, famously went for a more expansive arrangement than their garage-rooted instincts might have chosen on their own, including orchestral strings that lift the chorus into a kind of cinematic weather. One of the most endearing facts about Iris is that it's also a story about knowing when to let someone else do the cool part. Resnick has joked in later interviews that when he tried to play the song's slide guitar solo himself, it sounded terrible. His memorable comparison was that it sounded like a bunch of cats fighting. So the part went to session guitarist Tim Pierce, whose performance delivered the smooth, aching glide the song needed. In other words, one of the most iconic textures in a generation-defining love song exists because the songwriter had the humility to step aside before the emotional spell got broken. When Iris was released on April 7th, 1998, 4 days before my 21st birthday, it behaved less like a normal single and more like a slow-moving takeover. Officially, it arrived as a single tied to City of Angels and as the lead single from the Goo Goo Dolls album, Dizzy Up the Girl. The funny thing is that the version that appears in the movie itself is a stripped-down acoustic variant, which is really misleading as to the string-laced rock ballad the studio version was. I don't know why this choice was made. Apparently Resnick says it was because they wanted something quieter for the scene it appears in or something like that. I'm sure he can confirm the real truth, but it was a little disappointing when you think that it's not doing justice to the original. Anyway, the song's real release mechanism was the late 90s West Coast media ecosystem. Radio, MTV, movie theaters, and the weirdly sacred space of the car. And it was in this ecosystem that I found it. The first time is vividly imprinted on my brain. I was spending a boring afternoon, wandering the Marina District on a Saturday just after my birthday, and decided to stop in at a small cafe I used to visit for a smoothie to take my mind off the ennui of trying to find a job. Anyway, I stepped inside the cafe just as the guitar solo was playing, and my ear immediately caught it. I was just stood there by the door, captivated by this wonderful, haunting slide guitar. Then, the crescendo arrived, with Resnick singing the chorus repeatedly as the strings rose and the music swelled to its final climax. I barely recognized the voice as him. It just didn't sound anything like a Goo Goo Dolls song. Then, after the song ended, the radio host declared that it was Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls, and I felt my heart flutter. I had to find this song. I had to get it. I wanted to hear it in full from beginning to end. My mission was no longer to get a job. It was to find that song. Track it down in whatever way I could. Then I found out it was tied to a Nicolas Cage supernatural romance movie, which had come out the day before my birthday. And so I marched down to the nearest movie theater one Saturday, bought a ticket, took my seat, and watched the movie the whole way through, only to be let down completely by the fact that it was not the full ballad, but the stripped-down acoustic version. I can remember thinking how this damn song was averting me. I felt like I was being mocked, not helped by the fact that the movie itself was kind of dull and boring. I did catch it in the end, though, playing on the radio in my dad's car as he and I drove to the Stonestown shopping center a few weeks later. It was a hot day, but I insisted on putting the windows up so I could hear it as clearly as possible through the speakers of my dad's Acura Legend. We just sat there in silence, listening to the whole song, my dad dividing his attention between the song and the road. It was perhaps the most surreal 5 minutes of my life. Dad and I on a road trip down 19th Avenue that seemed to have no beginning or end. The song put me almost into some kind of blissful trance, like I'd spent my whole life in the car and it was floating in time and space with no origin or destination. Then, when the song ended, I felt totally numb. My head was totally empty of thoughts. All I could hear was Resnick's voice and the haunting melody for the rest of the day. I know this sounds very, very silly, but I was in an uncertain part of my life at that point, and this song seemed to turn a switch in my head. I can't fully describe it in words. You simply had to be there to understand. In that moment, in that part of history, it's the brief period of my life I go back to, when I'm feeling nostalgic, when I'm feeling sad or lonely, when I dream of less complicated times, back before smartphones and social media, back when the Twin Towers were still standing, back when everything seemed so simple and untainted by the complexities we seemed determined to imprint on our lives today. Nothing ever has or ever will replicate my dad and I driving down through Golden Gate Heights on that blisteringly hot midday in May 1998. Just the two of us. It was pure magic. Anyway, putting all that aside, the numbers did eventually catch up with the sensation. Iris hit major chart peaks around the world and became a defining hit for the band, including a top 10 peak on the U.S. Billboard Hot 100. Its U.S. chart story is famously quirky, because for a stretch, it dominated airplay while being limited by the era's rules and industry practices around physical single releases. It spent a then-record 18 weeks at #1 on Billboard's Hot 100 airplay chart, a statistic that sounds almost fake until you remember what radio was like in 1998. You drove anywhere, at any hour, and at some point the song would find you. On the West Coast, where commutes are long enough to develop full emotional arcs, that level of saturation turned Iris into a companion. It could be the soundtrack to a first crush, a last fight, a late-night drive over a bridge, or a lonely trip to nowhere in particular, just to feel like you were somewhere. Reception was complicated in a way that now feels charmingly 1990s. Plenty of listeners loved it immediately and openly. Plenty of others loved it while performing a small theater piece called I'm Too Cool for This, which usually involved rolling their eyes while refusing to change the station. Among certain rock purists, the Goo Goo Dolls still carried the stain that any band got in that era the moment they proved they could write a ballad that worked. But the song's emotional construction is so sturdy that even backlash ended up reinforcing its fame. People didn't just have opinions about Iris, they had positions, like it was a referendum on sincerity itself. The West Coast, with its collision of punk history, alternative radio culture, and Hollywood-scale melodrama, was exactly the place where that argument could last for decades. And then, there's my big, slightly reckless claim. Why did the 1990s produce the greatest love song ever written? Not the only great love song, not even the only great one from that decade, but the one that still behaves like a cultural heirloom passed hand to hand. A big part of the answer is that Iris is a love song that refuses to be only a love song. It's romantic, yes, but it's also about identity, fear, and the longing to be understood without being exposed. The central confession, wanting someone to know who you are, hits different depending on who's listening. You'll notice also that at no point is the word love actually mentioned in its lyrics. Most love songs are pretty on the nose, let's be honest.
And I love you so.
It's the way you love me, baby.
I need your love.
It's all about love, what love feels like, how to dissect love and crave love. While there are many great love songs, much like Christmas songs, they get kinda repetitive. And in many cases beyond cringe, almost like the singer or songwriter has to shove down your throat how important love is. So much so that you almost find yourself getting put off by it. Iris, though, was a real breath of fresh air for me. That four-letter word didn't appear, yet the message it sought to convey remained unblemished. If anything, it was emphasized further and made more broad in who or what it could be referring to. Its ambiguity is its strength, unconsciously expanding its appeal beyond the usual crowd. For teenagers, it can feel like a declaration of existence, the kind you make when you're convinced no one on earth has ever felt what you're feeling, even though half your class is secretly crying to the same track. For adults, it can sound like the distilled panic of time passing, the awareness that real intimacy gets harder as you accumulate defenses. For people who have felt unseen because of shyness, disability, immigration, class, race, or sexuality, the lyric can read less like romance and more like a plea for recognition, a desire to be acknowledged as fully human in a world that keeps trying to flatten you. For couples, it can be a wedding song, a prom song, or a breakup song, sometimes all with the same partner if life has a dark sense of humor. For mourners, it can attach itself to one person so completely that hearing the opening becomes a tiny time machine you didn't ask to ride. My one complaint, though, is this. Why isn't this song playing at the Bellagio fountains? I mean, come on! The song is practically gift-wrapped for dreamy-eyed couples and visiting tourists to hear echoing across the strip while the fountains dance. We need to start a petition, people. Anyway, getting back on topic, the song also works because it holds two impulses in tension without resolving them. It wants to hide and it wants to be witnessed. It wants to be close, and it's afraid of what closeness costs. That push-pull is basically the emotional operating system of the 1990s, a decade that loved irony but couldn't quite stop itself from yearning in public. The West Coast amplified that contradiction. A culture that sold chill as an identity while pumping out art that was, at its core, desperately earnest. For me, as a fan of the band before they were truly famous, seeing the Goo Goo Dolls shoot to meteoric success was like watching your favorite baseball team hit the big leagues. You knew they were a great band with all the momentum to write fantastic songs, but in the mid-1990s, apart from name, they were always on the periphery, buried under the remains of grunge like Foo Fighters and the Smashing Pumpkins, or dance party anthems with the Spice Girls. But then, in a twist of fate, in fact, almost by accident, they made this one song. So perfectly timed, so perfectly set, with a chord structure and lyrics that go straight into the deepest part of your heart and soul. And it erupted. To say I was thrilled would be an understatement, and it was great to talk among my friends about how the band they once brushed off as not happening exploded to glory. After Iris, the Goo Goo Dolls kept going, which sounds obvious until you remember how often the culture tries to freeze bands in the moment it liked them best. They released more hits, toured, evolved, and kept Iris in their live sets because audiences demanded it, and because the band understands what it means to have written something people use to mark their own lives. The song's legacy widened in the streaming era when classic stopped meaning old and started meaning always available. In November 2024, it was certified diamond by the RIAA, a formal recognition of a song that had already become informal property of the public. It continued to resurface through covers, talent shows, and new placements, including appearing on the soundtrack for the 2024 film Deadpool and Wolverine, which helped push it back into the cultural bloodstream yet again.
He has risen, baby girl.
And I don't want the world to see me, 'cause I don't think that they'd understand.
I have to admit, even at 47 years old, when I saw that scene of them coming around the corner and the music erupts, I squeaked with excitement in a way I haven't done since I was about 12. That's how much I love this song. That's the final trick Iris pulls, and it's why the greatest love song argument doesn't sound totally ridiculous when someone says it with a straight face. The song is specific enough to feel personal and broad enough to feel communal. It's dramatic without being abstract. It's tender without being polite. It has the sweep of a movie soundtrack because it literally is one, but it's anchored by details that feel like real life. The cracked voice, the stubborn chord drone, the sense that the singer is confessing something he can barely admit to himself. It's the rare song that can be overplayed and still survive, because once it attaches to a memory, it stops being background noise and becomes part of someone's internal timeline. If the 1990s were louder and shinier and more communal, Iris is one reason why. It's a song that doesn't just remind people what they loved, it reminds them how they used to listen. On the West Coast, where the horizon is always visible in some direction, and longing is practically a local industry, that kind of song doesn't fade. It just keeps finding new drivers, new headphones, new late-night conversations, and new people quietly deciding that actually, yes, they do want the world to see them, at least for the length of one chorus.
I just want you to know who I am. I just want you to know who I am. I just want you to know who I am. Come along, let's sing where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199X, we're here just for you, for you.